So as I've gone on, coming from an agnostic atheist background, I have come to see truth in religion in this way. And I believe that reincarnation is a picture of states of development on this plane, just as I look on the Catholic versions of limbo and hell as loss of connection to your own true loving soul spirit, which you could call your Christ spirit if you wanted. And so you can become an insect. I remember looking at one lady I was involved with after I'd left her, and she looked at me and she had this twittering insect love in her eyes, and I'd already realized she was, one guy talked about her and said she's like a black widow, and I saw her as like a praying mantis. You know, I came up with the idea of emotional vampirism, and some years later 2 psychotherapists have written about emotional vampirism, and that goes back to the Middle Ages. The incubus and the succubus were portrayed as like bat-like devils, one's male and one's female, that feeds on you while you're asleep. And I believe it's an interpretation of the same thing. There are some people who hook into other people and drain their emotional energy and feed on it, and they're like emotional vampires. Well, I think reincarnation is of that nature, about this life. Because if you're on an insect level or a vampire level, you're living in a kind of very unpleasant inner state, and you know, which is allied to concepts of hell, and you are not going to progress to the higher levels of consciousness until you give up your parasitism or evil or whatever particular variety of human consciousness you're trapped in.
But you don't believe that it's tied to some form of existence?
Well, there's one way of looking at that. Once you go beyond space and time, if you're saying we had other lives and we're now reborn, that means it's beyond this material plane, that existence. Well, if there are other lives, there's no guarantee when you recall one that you're recalling your own. Because I actually do have a belief in a kind of spiritual group consciousness for species and for mankind that actually exists beyond our individual selves, which ties in with the Buddhist idea of when you die the drop goes back to the ocean, or Jung, the racial subconscious or the universal subconscious, that there's consciousness that exists beyond our individual beings. But of course, if that's so, it's outside of this normal materialistic plane. Now, you're moving into metaphysics rather than science, because science takes the attitude, if I've never seen China, it doesn't exist. Well, you cannot examine the invisible, the ineffable, with the material instruments and organs that we have, because they're constituted out of the material plane, and the immaterial plane exists beyond that. In other words, it's very hard to look down a microscope and see water. You see right through it, unless it's electron microscope, but the visual microscope, because it's not tuned in to see something that's transparent.
Well, one thought that I've had, all my life, is if these other dimensions, worlds, exist in any form, I can relate it to radio signals and TV signals that are in this room right now. We can't pick them up without the television.
Exactly.
But they're in this room. And if we have the right receiver,
I believe that, yes, I believe that's a picture of spiritual levels. That the people who, often you will find people who are involved in something beyond themselves. Some kind of social, ideological, spiritual field, whether it be religion or civil disobedience like Martin Luther King, the rights of the dispossessed, Gandhi and so on. They begin devoting their self to something outside of themselves, and it appears that they begin on a pathway of inspiration, which I believe inspiration is like tuning into the information that's already there. Einstein said, "It is not so amazing that I have discovered these elegant laws that the universe obeys. What's amazing is that the universe obeys them," which indicates he's saying that something created this universe to obey these elegant laws. You could call it, instead of the creator with the big C, the designer with the big D. And when you go to the very high levels of science, like David Boehmer, who won the Nobel Prize for Science for quantum physics work, or Einstein, who everybody pretty much knows, they all begin to move towards a spiritual understanding of the universe, as where their science takes them to the edge of what is knowable by the intellect and the conscious mind. And you find, of course, in hypnotic trance, not only with regression to past lives, some people in trance, they can kind of hear and see things that you can't normally hear. I'm talking about even physically. And then there are those whose intuition and inspiration in trance goes up, and then there's some clairvoyants who are real. I'm not talking about all the people that are charlatans. Oh, some people believe they have those powers, but they're just misguided. But when you certain times see people who do amazing things that are inexplicable, that are not sleight of mind, as I call it, or any kind of phony stuff, you come across occasional cases like this lady who suddenly started speaking that language, where people can tune in inspirationally to non-physical planes. And I've had a couple of experiences in my own life of exactly that there's absolutely no possible scientific explanation. I don't know if you want cases or not.
Sure, just give me an example.
Okay, one is really odd. I used to watch a business program on the TV, and it included a report on the Japanese stock market, the Nikkei. And I used to look at it every morning when I got up. One day I walked across the room, and I don't visualize, I'm a very verbal thinking kind of person. I walked towards the TV, and I got this crystal clear image of the Japanese stock market, the graph, and it had dropped 1,000 points. I turned it on, and it had dropped 500 points, which was huge, and the next day it dropped another 500. Now this is bizarre. I didn't put any money into it. I wish I had.
But it was impactful to you at the time.
Of course. I mean, why did I get that picture? I don't picture things. And it was truthful, only slightly out of kilter, which reports of these things often are. Then the other one was even more upsetting, even though I know about these things, to actually experience it, because I used to read a lot of the occult. I was outside, 30 yards down the street, and again I got this clear crystal image of my lady friend who I was on the outs with, sitting at the top of the stairs, smoking a cigarette, looking like a little orphan. And that's through the wall, as well as being 20 yards away. And she had a key to my apartment. Well, well, that's strange. And I came up the stairs and I heard this voice saying, "Hi, Brian." And I looked up, and she was exactly as I had pictured her, sitting at the top of the stairs. And she said she'd come in, but because we weren't getting along, and we weren't really kind of together, she'd felt uncomfortable as a privacy issue being in my apartment. I didn't know she was coming over. And she'd moved outside and sat on the stairs. And when I looked up and saw her, she said my face went chalk white, because I was actually experienced kind of a precognition. And there's no way scientifically, and as I said, I was raised in an agnostic, materialistic, and I studied scientific background. There is no way that I can explain that scientifically. Now, whether it's like radio waves and that kind of stuff, but if it's outside of known vibrations on the material plane, we're dealing with something invisible.
Well, perhaps we will come up with instruments that will read it from there.
Well, as I said, if it's outside the material plane, it's hard for material atoms to register it. But we have these kind of experiences going back thousands of years. And I once did a survey talking to people, and I found out 50% of the population, when I told them mine, so they knew I wasn't going to think they were crazy when they told me either their own personal ones or loved ones that they trusted, wives, mothers, and so on, I found out 50% of the population has had these experiences. And there is one particular experience that has been repeated again and again and again, which is someone waking up or awake, suddenly knowing a relative or a loved one has died, maybe round the other side of the globe, and when they check it out, and with the time difference, it's exactly the moment that person died, and they often see an image of the person kind of smiling at them and disappearing. and that experience has been repeated many and documented many times. Well, either these perfectly ordinary people with no axe to grind are all lying or all delusional. This is a repeated experience. But science takes the point of view, unless you can repeat an experience in the laboratory, it's not real. Well, in that case, if a horse suddenly has a good day and wins a race and can never win a race again, it didn't win that first race. Well, obviously that's not true. Not everything is reproducible.